We're going to begin with message number 3 tonight in the series on God's obstacle course. And what I'd like to do is just briefly go back and hit the main principles from messages 1 and 2. First thing I want to point out to is that God does not waste obstacles. They all have purposes for our life, and those obstacles have a purpose that's related to the will of God. God knows what kind of obstacle to bring to develop you and me. He knows exactly why to bring that particular obstacle. He knows when to insert the obstacle in our lives, and He knows where to place that obstacle to where it will do the most good. So we actually have only looked at one major principle. I want to try to answer 5 questions that counselees have asked me over the years about why they have problems. Principle number 1 I gave you was this: obstacles are selected by God in accordance with our spiritual level at the moment. That's why in 1 Corinthians 10:13 we know that God never gives us more than we can bear. We often feel like He does. I've often said, Lord, boy, this is really a heavy load. Are you sure you made the right choice to give me this one? And but one thing we learned about Him from 1 Corinthians 10:13 is all of the obstacles are common to mankind. We also learned that they are consistent with the level of faith of the person who receives them at that moment. We also learned that they come with modification potential. That's what a way of escape means. It doesn't mean that God takes it away or God takes us out of it all the time. It means that we're able to go through a process of modification. And then they challenge us for the next level. And then last of all, the entire process of obstacles coming into our lives is directly dependent upon the faithfulness of God. So while God accompanies on life's obstacle course, when you and I are out there, there may be some practical choices that we have to make. In other words, God doesn't do for us what we can do for ourselves, and then He gives us promises to follow when we're in a situation. So you probably remember the incident in the Valley of Elah, 1 Samuel 17. David came down to bring some food to his brothers, and he found out that there was a defiant Philistine giant by the name of Goliath out there taunting the people of Israel. And he would just simply walk up and down the valley and challenge the people, the warriors of Israel, send somebody out to fight with me. He became an obstacle that had to be overcome if Jehovah was going to be honored. So Goliath was probably over 9 feet tall, and his weaponry and armor formed a massive protection for him. And no one in Saul's army would tackle this obstacle. We're told they were all hiding in their tents. David told King Saul, I will take the challenge and I'll go out against him. And of course the response to that was laughter and ridicule, right? So when you and I choose to face the obstacles that God allows into our lives, we may have to face laughter and ridicule from those who don't think we can do it. And when facing obstacles, we may have to make choices. Choices that will help us to fight the battle or overcome the obstacle, but God is there with us. So that leads me to the second principle that I want you to get, and here it is. Obstacles are selected by God to include the human effort to make specific choices. Obstacles are selected by God to include the human effort to make specific choices. You know, a lot of times we would rather God just snap His fingers and get rid of it, right? But God says, wait a minute, there's a battle coming on here and you're going to have to make some choices to handle this. I promise you that you'll win. I promise that you'll rise above it. I promise that I'll be with you when you walk down into that valley. But you're going to have to do some things on your own. Saul, as you may remember, wanted David to take the king's armor, 1 Samuel 17, 38 and 39. And David's this little shepherd boy, probably about 5'10". And we know that Saul stood up head and shoulders above all the men. So you can imagine David trying to take that armor. So he rejected the armor, and it may have been misunderstood by the soldiers and maybe even by the king. The king just offered you his armor. What's wrong with you? But the obstacle demanded that David make a choice that he knew he could handle. He told King Saul, he said, look, I haven't proved this armor, meaning I haven't gone into battle with this armor. I've not worked with this armor. This is all too new for me. So what did David do? According to 1 Samuel 17:40, he took his staff and he chose 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and then he took his sling in his hand and he walked down into the valley of Elah to face his obstacle. And when God in his sovereignty selects obstacles for you and me to face, he always includes opportunities within the obstacle for us to make choices for facing the obstacle. That's one of the ways we develop our perception, one of the ways we develop our power of choice. And this is essential for us in exercising faith in God's promises, and that is how we grow. You see, our growth in facing obstacles hinges on both God and us. On God, all that hinges there is God's promises and his enablement. He's already said we can win the victory over any obstacle he allows in our life, and that he will enable us. He's already told us that. But then we have a responsibility too, and that is to trust his promises and to take whatever action seems to be necessary for facing that crisis. And by the way, there's a principle here, and here it is: we only conquer obstacles we're willing to face. We don't conquer the ones we don't face. So when all the soldiers were hiding in their tents, they weren't going to win any victories. You don't win victories hiding in your tent, particularly if you're supposed to be a warrior. So Saul and his warriors were going to never defeat Goliath because they were unwilling to confront him. I remember being in basic training at Lackland Air Force Base years ago, and I remember the TI came in to our barracks just about the end of the day, and he said, "Okay, men, tomorrow we run the obstacle course." And I remember one of the young men that was always asking questions, he said, "Sarge, I don't know if I can run the obstacle course." And the TI replied, "Airman, that's the purpose of the obstacle course, to find out what you cannot do, and then we will train you to do what you never thought you could do." That's the purpose of the obstacle course. Well, God uses obstacles to test us. Then he trains us to go farther than we ever thought we could go. So what obstacles has God allowed into your life? They may reveal to you what you cannot do. That's okay. Then they may actually point you in the direction of principles in the Word of God that will train you to do what you never thought you could do. Now just think back over your Christian life. I can think back over 65 years. I think of some battles I've fought, some giants I've faced, some obstacles I've encountered. I would never, on the day I got saved, have thought I would ever face anything like that. And if I had thought I would face it, I would never have thought that I could overcome it. And the key is we can't on our own many times. We need the power of God. God is constantly trying to get us to think like Jesus Christ. Remember what Paul said in Romans 12:1 and 2? Let me read it to you. He said, "I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." That word, renewing of your mind, is an interesting word in the Greek. It means to go into a room, rip out everything in the room, and start over and refinish it completely on the inside. So God wants to refinish our thinking. Paul would later write to the church at Philippi, he said, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus." So now we know why in Romans 12:2, he wanted a renewing of the mind, because he wanted it to match the layout of the mind of Christ. Now, God does not insert obstacles in our lives just to make life tougher and more miserable and filled with pain and sit back in heaven with his arms folded and kind of giggle when we goof up. That's not the purpose of obstacles. Every obstacle is part of an eternal plan. And that plan is to maximize our potential and to reveal how God's promises practically fit into daily decisions. A lot of people have this idea, well, I'm religious, so that's all that really matters. No, that's not all that matters. What really matters is, do you know Christ personally? And once you've accepted him as your personal Savior, have you turned over your life to him? You allow him to give direction to your life. Remember when Moses faced obstacles, he consulted God for divine input, and then he acted in accordance with many times human skills. Joshua faced obstacles, talked to God, and after receiving guidance from God, used the skills that he had developed under Moses' leadership to go God's way. And then the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul's life was replete with more obstacles than any person I've ever read about. And then he made choices after he consulted God, choices that required his own skills in order for him to go God's way. The lives of these men give us a pattern that we would do well to follow when we're facing our own obstacles. First of all, consult God, usually in prayer and in compliance with God's word. Secondly, choose what complies with God's word to go against the obstacle. And then thirdly, trust God's promise to honor our obedience to his word. So we've been looking here in this series at principles for facing obstacles as challenges and making the right choices when we face those obstacles. The first principle that I wanted you to get was this one: God selects obstacles in line with our spiritual levels. God never is going to bring us to an obstacle that it would be impossible for us to surmount even with his help. And then secondly, God selects obstacles which require us to use human effort in order to make certain choices and decisions in resolving that obstacle. But let me give you a third principle. God selects obstacles for our course which reinforce our dependency upon him. God selects obstacles for our course which reinforce our dependency upon him. I can remember running the obstacle course at Lackland Air Force Base. There'd be a TI at every one of the major obstacles there, and many times they would just come in and give you some guidance about what to do. We were dependent upon them because these guys had been doing it for years, running it for years, in the military for years. Have you ever thought about how ridiculous it must have sounded to Moses when God told him to take his rod, strike a rock with his rod, and water would spring forth? Have you ever thought about, and Moses was well educated. He went through when he was Pharaoh's daughter, he went through all of the best training in Egypt, the equivalent probably of an earned doctorate degree in our world today. He was exposed to all of the religions, he was exposed to all of the philosophy, and he was exposed to all the training that an Egyptian child would get from birth all the way up to graduating from the school. And so he goes out into the wilderness. Remember, he resisted the call in the first place in Exodus 3. He gave all kinds of excuses why God was making a mistake to ask him to go face Pharaoh. Made all kinds of excuses. But then he gets out there in the wilderness. He's there with the people of Israel, and they're thirsty, and they're whining and complaining to Moses and said, "You're the one that brought us out here. We're thirsty, and you can't provide the water." So then Moses goes to God, and he says, "Boy, this is a mess. What am I going to do?" And God says, "Well, simply go to this." The word for rock can also be mountain. I don't think it was a little rock with a spring about this wide coming out of it. It's probably river size coming out of the side of a mountain. You got 4 million people you got to give water to, you know. So he goes over to the rock. God said, "Now here's what you do. You take the rod, you smite the rock, and as soon as you smite the rock, the water is going to come out." Now, that sounds pretty ridiculous, doesn't it? I mean, if I were thirsty today and somebody said, "Why don't you go, smite a rock?" I'd say, "What?" But you know what he did? I've heard people say that Moses made water come out of a rock. No, he didn't. If you think that, you miss the point. Actually, he didn't make the water come out. God made the water come out of the rock because God honored Moses' obedience. That's why the water came out of the rock. It wasn't Moses' power. It was God's power honoring Moses' obedience. You ever think about this? God wants to honor your obedience with the same power. Are you willing to obey when it doesn't seem practical? to obey? Well, Moses had a part. Obedient striking of the rock. God had a part to honor his obedience. Have you ever thought about how it must have sounded to Joshua? They came to the city of Jericho, and it was one of the largest cities. Some people say that the walls were so thick that you could drive a couple of chariots around the top of the walls. That's how thick they were. I don't know, but I've heard that. And God told Joshua, he said, well, don't worry about it. He said, you're going to be able to take the city of Jericho. Here's what you do. For 6 days, you march around the city one time. On the seventh day, you march around 7 times. Then you blow a trumpet and shout, and the walls will come down. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound militarily possible to me, does it? Do you? But that's not the thing. You see, the real thing is this. God doesn't give us responsibilities to carry out based upon common sense all the time. Sometimes he gives us assignments to carry out that make absolutely no sense, but they're okay. They don't contradict any Bible principle. So the human perspective is going to lead us to missing the entire point. God brought the walls down, and Joshua did not conquer the city of Jericho. God brought the walls of Jericho down in response to the obedience of Joshua. Joshua, I don't know what he may have thought. He may have said, well, I don't get this, but every time I was with Moses and God told us to do something and we did it, he honored it. So I'm going to go ahead and do it. So he'd tell the people, okay, get up, it's time to march around Jericho. They march around Jericho. And then on the 7th day, they march around 7 times, blow the trumpet, shout, and the walls came down. The people obeyed God, and God honored their obedience by bringing down the walls. So God places obstacles before us, and he always does so with a deep understanding of what we need and where we are. He brings the obstacles to identify the present spiritual level at which we're functioning. And secondly, he brings the obstacles to focus on the human effort that he wants us to use in this conquering process. And then thirdly, he gives us the obstacles to remind us we need to trust him, not ourselves. The Apostle Paul had what he called a thorn in the flesh. Do you remember that? And it appears when you read the context of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, it appears that Paul really understood the reason for the thorn in the flesh, but he didn't like it, and so he wanted it removed. But God said, no. Now I want you to follow along here, 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 9. It appears from the text that Paul realized that the following reasons caused his personal obstacle to be there. He says this in 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 9. He says, first of all, it was to remind him that it was about what God called him to do, not what Paul could do. He says, lest I should be exalted above measure. So the obstacle was to remind him that it was about what God could do, not what Paul could do. Secondly, the obstacle was to remind him of the reality of Satan. Satan wants to use anything God allows into our life to gain Satan's perspective in our lives. That's what he wants to do. Listen to what he said. He calls it a messenger of Satan to buffet me. So the obstacle reminded him that it was about what God could do, not what Paul could do, and it was to remind him about the reality of Satan. And thirdly, the obstacle was to reinforce Paul's absolute need of the grace of God in his life. God told Paul, he said, my grace is sufficient for thee. And then number 4, the obstacle was to focus on the positive outcomes of obstacles. Now, we don't normally think of obstacles as having positive outcomes, but God brings them into our lives in order to produce positive outcomes. Paul said this in a few verses later. He says, I now glory in mine infirmities. So it changed his perspective about the obstacles. I now glory in mine infirmities. Changed his perspective about the obstacle. Then he says, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. changed his perspective about how to handle the obstacles. So first, it changed his perspective about the obstacles, glory and mine infirmities. And secondly, it changed his perspective about how to handle the obstacles that came into his life, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. You never have the power of Christ upon you if you can do what you have to do. It has to be by the power of Christ. And then thirdly, he says, when I am weak, then I am strong. So he changed his perspective about why God used obstacles, right? So first he changed his perspective about the obstacle, then he changed his perspective about how to handle them, and then last he changed his perspective about why God brought obstacles into his life. One thing is for certain when you read God's word, no servant of God was able to avoid God's obstacle course for his life. Not one. You can name any servant and you will see that he faced obstacles. Remember Paul's admonition about God's tests? He said they are common to man. I can count on these points about every obstacle I face. Everything I face. Number one, God always selects the obstacle at my spiritual level. I can count on that. So I can't say I can't. Secondly, God always reserves for me choices to make in handling each obstacle. And then thirdly, God always wants us to allow obstacles to reinforce our dependency upon him. Now I want to close with a thought. Now you may disagree with this, okay? But don't write me off as a heretic and don't write the statement off as something that's not true. I want you to think about it. If you don't get it when I give it to you, write it down and think about it. I had to think about it a long time. Here it is. Call it a principle if you want to. Count the number of obstacles you have faced in your life. And then put a comma there. Count the number of obstacles you have faced in your life. Put a comma. And you will have evidence of God's desire to bless you. Count the number of obstacles you have faced in your life, and you will have evidence of God's desire to bless you. End of quotation. Now, if that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you right now, don't worry about it. Take it home, pray over it, think about it, let God speak to your heart and to your life. Okay, let's stand together for prayer. Lord, we love you. Thank you so much for bringing obstacles into our lives. Help us to learn, as Paul did, those lessons from 2 Corinthians chapter 12 about obstacles. And help us to realize that every obstacle is an opportunity for us to demonstrate our confidence and our faith in the promises that you've made to us in the Word of God. So as we open the altar tonight, we ask you to speak to our hearts in a special way now in Jesus' name. Amen.